Good evening, everyone. This week's Parshas Emor, Tavshin Pei Hey. We will be starting somewhat towards the end of the Parsha, Perek Chav Daled, chapter 24, Pasuk Hey, verse 5. Got that? 24, 5.
You said the beginning.
No, I said not the beginning.
Oh, wow. I missed what now.
Chav Daled, 5. Okay. V'lakachta seiles. Hashem says to Moshe, you'll take fine flour, v'afisa isa shtemes reichales. You shall break them into 12 loaves. Shnei esrein miyah hachalo ha'echas. Each challah being 2/10 ephahs. V'samta isa mishtayim aroches. You should place them in 2 stacks. Sheish aroches, 6 per stack. Ala shulchan atar lefnei Hashem. On the pure table that is before God. So this is referring to what we call the Lechem HaPanim. One of the vessels, one of the articles in the Mishkan was the shulchan, was the table. And on the table there were breads. The breads were called the Lechem HaPanim. Literally translates means the bread of face, the face breads. Because as Rashi says, they were formed in a way that the sides came up and faced each other. So there were these special breads that were put on the shulchan. The Torah tells us here that you take soles, you take flour, you make 12 loaves, you make 2 stacks of 6, and then you put on the arrangement pure frankincense, and this frankincense is going to be for the bread as a remembrance in heaven to Hashem. Every Shabbos, the bread shall be arranged before God on the table always. Me'ez b'nei Yisrael bris olam, from the Jewish people as an eternal covenant. V'ha'isa la'aron levanav, these breads shall be for Aaron and his sons. V'chalu b'makam kadosh, they shall eat it in a holy place. Ki kodesh kadeshimhu, for it is the holy of holies. Lo to him, me'ishay Hashem, from the offerings of God, chok olam, in eternal law. So here is where the Torah is telling us the details of the Lechem HaPanim. The Lechem HaPanim is actually mentioned previously in the Torah, but without any details. It just mentions that there will be bread on the table. It is in this week's Parsha that we get more details. We know how many, how they're arranged. That arranged with them is this frankincense, which is a type of a spice that's burned. It's arranged every Shabbos, which means every Shabbos they change the breads. And these breads are eaten by Aaron and his sons. Is
this a sacrifice for God?
No. The breads never go on the altar. The breads are baked. They're put on the table. Then every Shabbos they're changed for other breads, and Aaron and the Kohanim eat them. Nothing to do with offering on a fire on the altar.
But this is a reference for God.
It's before God. It is considered, you're right, it is called Me'ishay Hashem, from the offerings of God. It's just not on the fire.
Not fire.
Not fire.
But it's after a week it should be eaten.
By the Kohanim. It goes to the Kohanim who eat it.
New one bacon and all.
Well, we'll see exactly the arrangement, but as they're changed, the old ones are eaten by the Kohanim. Okay? Now, what's important to know is that, like I said, this is not the first time that the Lechem HaPanim is mentioned in the Torah. In the end of the book of Shmos, Parshas Pekudei, after the Mishkan is finished being constructed, Hashem tells Moshe what has to be done. This has to be put here, this has to be put there. Hashem tells Moshe about the shulchan and to arrange the bread on it. And then later on, and then again in Parshas Pekudei, the Torah relates how everything was constructed. And in Parshas Pekudei, which is Perek Mem, chapter 40, Pasuk Yud Zayin, so first it says that the erection of the Mishkan on a permanent basis took place on the 1st of Nisan, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the 1st of Nisan. The Gemara tells us that year, the 1st of Nisan came out on a Sunday. That was the day of the week it came out on. Now, later on in this chapter, where again the Torah is talking about the actual arrangement and erection of the Mishkan, Pasuk Chav Beis, verse 22, Vayiteras hashulchan ba'oel moed al yerech hamishkan tzafona. Moshe placed the table in the Mishkan on the northern side. Vayarech olav erech lechem b'pnei Hashem, and he arranged an arrangement of bread before God. That means that he placed the table in the Mishkan where it needed to be, and he arranged the bread on the table. Now, we don't know what this arrangement was. We don't know any details about it. We know there's an arrangement of bread. We don't know the details. The details, you're going to have to wait for our Parsha, this week's Parsha, to know the details of it. But it does mention that the breads were arranged. So the commentaries have the following problem. I just mentioned to you that in our Parsha, the Torah says, that when do you put the breads on the table? What day of the week?
Sunday.
Shabbos. With our Parsha.
Our
Parsha says that when do you put the breads on the table? On Shabbos. Right. Our Parsha says Shabbos. But if the Torah says there that on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, when the Mishkan was erected, that they arranged the bread, but the Gemara says that what day of the week was that? Sunday. So we have a problem, don't we? The Torah tells us that the Lechem HaPanim goes on the table on Shabbos. And here they put it up on Sunday. How's that work? That doesn't seem right. Excuse me?
Maybe Shabbat, after Shabbat, at the end of Shabbat, can be start
Shabbos is Shabbos and Sunday is Sunday. Okay? So the commentaries, one commentary, the Malbim says, gives two answers. One answer is that you'll have to say that even though the whole Mishkan was erected and put together completely on that Sunday, nonetheless, when it came to the table and the bread, you know when that was done? The day before on Shabbos. Meaning, when the Torah says, and he brought the table into the Mishkan, and he arranged the bread, he didn't arrange the bread that day. It means he already had arranged the bread from the day before on Shabbos. It takes it out of the simple way of how you would have regularly read the pasuk, but you're forced to say that. You're forced to say, I believe what it means is that we do know the Mishkan was erected every day before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which was the Shiva Simei Malum, the 7 days of training for the Kohanim. Moshe would erect the Mishkan every day and take it apart. Well, on the Shabbos before, he already had, he had the table, and he arranged the bread on the table, and on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, I guess he brought it all into the Mishkan. But he already had made the table, he arranged the bread on the table on the Shabbos before, which is the day before, and then when the Mishkan was permanently put up on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, I'm assuming it means he brought the table in with the bread already arranged on it from the day before on Shabbos. But at the end of the day, the Malbim says it wasn't, even though the way you read the Psukim, it would sound like it was arranged on that day itself. Says the Malbim, you're going to have to say it was already arranged on the day before, on the Shabbos before, because it's got to be Shabbos.
The table was...
You'd have to say, the way I understand it is that it would have to already be that before that the table was already made.
A table,
Table was made, and on Shabbos he put the bread on the table, and then on Sunday, right, it was all brought into the Mishkan to be part of the permanent building of the Mishkan.
It means to carry table.
I think so. I think that's what the Malbim means. I think that's what it means. But the point is, the Malbim is trying to give an answer to say, if it's got to be Shabbos, how did it happen? Well, it has to happen. It means that the arrangement of the bread had to happen on the Shabbos before. That's what you'll have to say. Either the day before, the whole week before. Let's not get into the details right now with that.
But once, it's not question where they baked.
They baked it where they had to bake it. It's not a big question where to bake it, as long as they were pure. As long as they weren't impure from a dead body. As long as they were pure, they were good to go.
No, but Shabbat.
No, they baked it before. You're allowed to bake it on Shabbos. The Lechem HaPanim was allowed to be baked on Shabbos.
Okay.
Just like the sacrifices could be brought, the bread could be made on Shabbos. Right. Part of the service. Right. Right.
No any problem.
Right. Correct. Okay. And another answer is, you're right. Typically it's supposed to be done on Shabbos, but you'll have to say that this was an exception because Hashem said, erect everything on this day. And part of that erection is the table with the bread. So this time it had to be done on Sunday. Typically it's done on Shabbos, and this time it had to be done on Sunday because this is what Hashem said to do. It was an exception. That's the basic other answer. So now I'm going to share with you another answer. That's a very interesting answer. And I'm going to call it it's going to be a Talmudic analysis answer. But before we get to this next answer, we have to go back to the first place where the Lechem HaPanim is mentioned. Okay, the first place Lechem HaPanim is mentioned. And that is in Parshat Truma, the first parsha where Hashem tells Moshe about building the Mishkan. So in Parshat Truma, it says, this is Perek Chafei Pasuk Lamed, chapter 25, verse 30. It talks about Hashem tells Moshe to make the table. That's one of the vessels of the Mishkan is the table. V'nasat al hashulchan lechem panim lefanai tamid. You shall place on the table the lechem panim, the special bread, before me always. So in discussing the construction, the first time Hashem tells Moshe about making a table, Hashem mentions, and on the table you're going to put the bread. Always. You'll put the bread there continuously. Now, the question is like this. The question should be asked, in Parshat Truma, we're talking about making the Mishkan. We're not talking about what you do with everything, right? It doesn't say what you do with the altars. It doesn't say what you do with the menorah in Parshat Truma. It just says how to construct it. So here by the table, it tells us how to construct the table, and it also tells us what we're going to do on the table, what we're going to do with the table. And it seems a little bit odd because, we're talking about the construction now, not what you do with the vessels. Now, maybe you'll say, all right, for some reason here, the Torah is just, so to speak, once we're talking about the table, we're going to talk about its usage. But the thing is like this. I read to you that it says in Parshat Truma, you will put on the table the Lechem HaPanim before me always. Always. Okay? Now, the word always has a very important halacha to it, has a very important lesson to it, an actual law. I mentioned to you that the breads were changed on Shabbos, right? All right, so you might think, okay, so how are the breads changed on Shabbos? They had the new breads, they took the old breads off the table, and then they put on the new one, right?
Looks like that.
That's what it would seemingly be, right?
Yeah.
The answer is no. It wasn't done like that. Rather, as they were taking off the old, the new was coming on. There was never a point that the table didn't have the breads. And you know where that comes from? That word tamid. The word tamid there in Parshat Truma, that word, when it says, and you'll put on the table, lechem panim before me always, continuously, means there must always continuously be bread on the table.
Okay, if you remove and place new one,
that's not the way to do it. Okay? Now, so it comes out now that the Torah in Parshat Truma, Hashem in Parshat Truma, when talking about the construction of the Mishkan, not only just does it, you want to say, well, once he mentioned the table, he mentioned its usage. Why? We don't know yet. But it didn't just do that. It actually told us a halacha. It told us there a law of the Lechem HaPanim that we derive from there. We don't derive that from Parshas and our Parsha. In our Parsha that talks about all the other details, our Parsha doesn't teach us this law. It's Parshas Truma that teaches us that law. So that means that we're not just, mentioning it, so to speak, oh, and by the way, this is what you do at the table. It's actually teaching us a very important law about it. So it would be very difficult to say that it's just mentioning the usage because we're just, we decided we'll talk about the vessel and what it's used for. Because it's here that it teaches us a very important law about the Lechem HaPanim. At the same time, we have to understand, well, if this is a law of Lechem HaPanim, why isn't it in our Parsha, like all the other laws? Okay? So this is now where we have to try to introduce a very interesting idea. This idea is mentioned, I have it in front of me here, a sefer called Ben Melech on the Torah, but actually he says that others also suggest this, and this is going to be an answer to the first question we started off with. And the answer begins with this. The Lechem HaPanim, the bread that's put on the table. So we assume that, it's what you do with the table, right? The table is the article, and what do you do on the table? You put the bread on the table. But the article is the shulchan, and the bread is what you do with the table. So the suggestion is that actually the bread has two aspects to it. Two aspects to it. One aspect is, as we're saying right now, you have the table, and just like you have sacrifices that are put on the altar, that's part of the avoda, that's part of the service in the Mishkan. Another form of service in the Mishkan is you put the bread on the table. That is how you would simply look at it. But we want to introduce now a new idea, that actually there's another aspect to the bread on the table, and that is, how you complete the making of the table? By putting the bread on it. The bread is not just what you do with the table. It's actually the completion of the table. The set table is the fully constructed table, which means that not only is the bread is not just a part of the service, it's a part of the table and thus a part of the construction of the Mishkan, which makes a lot of sense now why it's in Parshas Truma, it's mentioned in Parshas Truma, because it's not just merely what you do with the table, it's part of the table. It's the completion of the table. And it's therefore in Parshas Truma, because yes, we're talking about the construction of the Mishkan, and part of the construction of the Mishkan is the making of the table, and the bread on the table is the completion of the making of the table. And so we're going to suggest we have one aspect of the bread, that it is a part of the table, and that's part of the construction of the Mishkan, and it also acts as a service. Like a sacrifice on the altar, it also acts as a service. There is a service in the Mishkan of putting the bread on the table, but it has both aspects to it.
Okay, there is no table without bread.
Call it like that, whichever way you want to say it. Whichever way you want to say it. But it's the completion of the table. You could say it like that, that's fine. Now, we just said that we learned the law of Tamid, right? The fact that it should continuously be there. Where does the Torah, meaning the fact is there's always bread on the table? Where does that come from? Parshas Truma, right? By Parshas Truma. And therefore, if the bread mentioned in Parshas Truma is part of the table, then the idea or the law of the bread continuously being on the table is part of that aspect of the bread. The bread is part of the table, and as part of the table, it has to be there continuously. Because it's there where the Torah teaches us this law of being continuous. So that law of the bread being continuous, that there should never be a point that there's no bread on the table, that is part of the aspect of the mitzvah. That's part of the aspect of the mitzvah of the lechem hapanim, of the bread on the table, as the bread being part of the table. Okay.
But we have another example is all time continuously. This is when the menorah should be.
Yeah, but that's mentioned later on. So that's part of the service of the menorah. You're right. It could be continuous as part of the service, which it is by the menorah. Here we're saying right now that it's at least part of the aspect of being part of the table. Now, when we go back to our parsha, it talks about you change the bread on Shabbos, right? Change the bread on Shabbos. So now, the fact that you have to put the bread on the table on Shabbos, right? Okay. So what is that an aspect in? Is that, clearly it's an aspect in Parshas Emor, right? Which would make it, which we could say it's part of the service, but is that also part of the law that we have that it has to be continuous? The table can never be without the bread. Is Shabbos part of that too? Meaning, the bread has to continuously be on the table, but the bread is only put on the table on Shabbos. Do the two things have to go together? Or do we say Shabbos, right, is when you do the service of the Mishkan, when you do the service of the bread? When do you do it? You do it on Shabbos. But the aspect, let's say, of the bread being continuous, does that also have to be done only on Shabbos? So perhaps we can say not. We could actually say that, as we said before, the fact that the bread should be continuous, that's part of the aspect of the bread as part of the table. But the idea that we put the bread on Shabbos, that's not an aspect of that. Because if you think about it, if it has to be there all the time, then it has to be there all the time. And that aspect is not dependent on Shabbos. That aspect is, it has to be there all the time. And therefore, you want to know why they were able to arrange the bread the first time on Sunday, not on Shabbos? Because you know why it was there? You know why they put it on Sunday? Because there is a rule that the bread has to always be on the table. And as the bread, that's an aspect of the fact that the bread is a part of the table. So if now they're erecting the table and they have to have the bread on the table, and the bread always has to be there on the table as part of the table, that doesn't have to be on Shabbos. That could be even on Sunday. On the first time that they made the Mishkan and they made the table, and the table had to be completed, and the table can only be, and the completion of the table with the bread is with the bread being there continuous. That doesn't depend on the day of Shabbos. That depends on if the bread needs to be there, the bread needs to be there.
After
But then after the Mishkan was erected, and now they have all the service to do in the Mishkan. So now the aspect of the bread as a service, that has to be done on Shabbos.
It looks like Sunday, it's by chance. Can be Wednesday.
Now, here's another question. What happens, right? What happens if, let's say, something happened to the bread? Something happened. They weren't able to arrange the bread on Shabbos. They weren't able to arrange it on Shabbos. They couldn't do it. For some reason, there was no bread. They couldn't do it. And now it's Wednesday, middle of the week. So what do you do then? Do you wait for Shabbos to put the bread on? Or do you put the bread on right away?
I believe maybe right away.
Now let's see. So it happens to be that there are those who interpret the words of the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud has this question. What happens if it wasn't able to be arranged on Shabbos, but now it can be arranged during the week? What do you do? Do you arrange it or not? Now, there's something very important to know. And this is going to be this is a fact, because the Mishnah in Menachah says this. Let's say, right? The Yerushalmi seems to be asking, well, should we or shouldn't we? But what if you did anyway? What if you arranged the bread on the table after Shabbos? That's what you did. Okay. Now, the next Shabbos comes, right? So, all right. So I changed the bread, right? I changed the bread, right?
Shabbos, of course, there is a direct.
Guess what?
Direction from here.
No.
Every Shabbos.
Nope. You're not gonna. You know why?
No.
Because there is another source that tells us that the only time you change the bread and then offer the frankincense that's mentioned is only if the bread has been on the table for a full week. If it hasn't been on a full week, you know what you're going to do with the bread? You're going to leave it there till next Shabbos.
Okay.
Till next Shabbos. So that means that if at the end of the day you put the bread on the table and it's not Shabbos, on Wednesday or Tuesday or Monday, you're not going to be able to do the service with the bread, which is to change it and to offer the frankincense until the next Shabbos. So now the question now there's
you missed one Shabbos.
Right. Now it's going to be there, yeah, right? But it's not. But you're not going to be able to do the mitzvah. Now, so the Yerushalmi's question really seems to be revolving around, okay, if I put the bread on the table, right? Do I do it do I do it? I mean, if I do it, I'm not going to be able to do the service. I'm not going to be able to do what I typically do with it. So do I not do it? Do I just not do it? Or do I do it anyway? Says Yerushalmi, you know why you do it? Because it says, you shall put on the table the Lechem HaPanim before me always. Parshat Truma. It says, you always have to have the bread there. And the Yerushalmi learns, according to this interpretation of Yerushalmi, whatever bread you have on it, it's got to be there. Even if it's going to be a bread, right? You're going to have to wait for the next Shabbos to do anything with it. You have to have bread on the table. Which means that even after we have the mitzvah of the Lechem HaPanim, and we already know that the service Lechem HaPanim is going to be done is going to be done, and the service can only be done if it was there a whole week. Nonetheless, you're going to put it down. You know why? Because the table can't be without the bread. The table cannot be without the bread. According to this interpretation of Yerushalmi, the Yerushalmi is saying that this mitzvah, this idea that the table has to always have the bread, is not dependent on Shabbos. And you know why it's not dependent on Shabbos? Based on this explanation, that's because when it comes to this law that the table should never be empty, that's part of the table. That's because the table needs it. It's a part of the table. And as part of the table, it has to always be there. If it comes out for some reason it wasn't there, okay, well then get it there. Get it there. Put it there. You're not going to be able to do the mitzvah until the following Shabbos? Okay, you won't. But at least you're going to have the tamid. At least you're going to have the bread continuously there. It's not dependent on Shabbos. And that's as we've been explaining. When it comes this law that the bread has to always be on the table, that was learned in Parshat Truma, where we're discussing the bread as part of the table. And as part of the table, it has to be there continuously. It can never be missing. And if it comes that it was missing, get bread onto there. Then there's another aspect. There's another aspect that the bread, Lechem HaPanim, is like a sacrifice. It's part of a service. And as part of the service, it has to be Shabbos. That needs Shabbos. That has to be done on Shabbos. It has to be the bread was there from the previous Shabbos. That's all part of the avoda aspect, the service aspect. From the aspect, though, of being part of the table, that's not dependent on Shabbos. That there, anytime you have the table, you want to have a table, you want to have a fully constructed table, you have to have the bread there, and it has to be there, and you can't have a table without the bread. The table, it says, tamid, the table always has to have the bread. As part of the table, the bread has to be there. And therefore, when they first made the table, they put on the bread for that aspect. And in case it comes out that even later on, when already we have a service of the Lechem HaPanim, if the bread for some reason wasn't on the table and it missed Shabbos, it's going to be put on because the table needs it. At the same time, there's the aspect of the mitzvah as a service, And as a service, that depends on Shabbos. That's done on Shabbos. And in a case where it wasn't there from Shabbos before, the mitzvah, the service won't be done of changing the bread and offering the levana, the frankincense, until the following Shabbos. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful evening.
It means this is something